Hello and welcome to The First Draft, a new podcast by the Foreign Policy Research Institute in which we'll examine the ideas emanating from world affairs over the next few months. I'm Robert Kaplan, Robert Strauss Houppé Chair in Geopolitics.
And I'm Dominic Green, Senior Fellow in the FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. Hello, and welcome to The First Draft, a podcast from the Foreign Policy Research Institute, with Robert Kaplan, the Robert Strauss Houppé Chair in Geopolitics at the FPRI, and me, Dominic Green, a Senior Fellow in the FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. Well, Robert, you ended the year, or began it, because it was a double issue for the New Statesman, with an article on the subject of Hamas, Israel, and the New World Disorder. In a short summary, what was it about?
It was actually about the new bipolar world. And by bipolar, I mean, if you put, I see a new alliance, a de facto alliance of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, all these great Eurasian land powers against the United States, Israel, conservative Sunni Arab regimes, and Europe. Now, this is a bit messy, and it's de facto because the Sunni Arab regimes, the conservative regimes like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the leaders go to bed each night hoping that Israel destroys Hamas and wake up in the morning and make pronouncements denouncing Israel for doing the same such thing. If you think that Russia is now aligned with Iran because of Ukraine, it's de facto, whereas Russia used to be in the middle between Israel and the radical Arab states for a long time, now has sided with Iran because it needs Iran's drones, its weaponries, etc. So you have Hamas, Iran, Russia, China, North Korea against Ukraine, Israel, the Sunni Arab regimes, the United States, and Western Europe, more or less. The key thing here, Dom, is that Ukraine and the Hamas war are now fused together with the same people on each side. So while they're two distinct wars, there is a linkage in terms of who's supporting who. So it's very much bipolar in that sense and will likely to continue that way.
One country that I wondered how it fits into this is Turkey. How does Turkey fall on this?
Turkey, after the October 7th attacks of Hamas against Israel, Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, was silent for about 24, 48 hours or something. And then he came out full bore support for Hamas, saying Hamas was the supporter of human rights, of children, of women. I mean, this is an absurdity given what happened on October 7th. But Erdogan is a very populist, cynical leader. He makes his calculations purely on how it affects his base in Turkey. So Turkey is leaning in the direction of Hamas, but it can always shift or change depending upon where Erdogan sees his advantage. Remember, the Cold War was not so clean. You had a lot of cross-cutting alliances. This is not completely clean either, but there is a shape. There is a shape now to world events that I think will continue for some time. And the weak link is the conservative Sunni Arab regimes, because they have to adhere publicly to a policy that they privately dislike because they're afraid of their own populations. And so far at least, Egypt and Saudi Arabia have handled it well. They have handled the demonstrations against Israel to the extent that there have been any. Saudi Arabia has kept the door open for a future deal with Israel, at least according to the American Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi in Egypt he's acted as a go-between between Israel and Hamas rather than break relations with Israel. He's a very valuable go-between for hostage releases, keeping humanitarian aid, etc. The Sunni Arab regimes, the conservative ones, and I include the Arab Gulf states as well, are keeping their fingers crossed and hoping at some point, and we may be close to that point, where Israel's all-out attack on Hamas slows up and they can get back to a kind of normality where they can have a de facto alliance with Israel against the radical Arabs and Iran.
One interesting thing, and obviously I hope we have time to talk more about the next phase of the Israel-Hamas war. One interesting thing here is I was wondering, is this the first major shift in world power in centuries in which the European states are not really central players? They seem to be much less significant than, say, Turkey and India as
That
pivot states or as
that
second tier powers in this.
That's a very brilliant point, and I'm not exaggerating it. It's true. Europe is marginal in a way. It is marginal because it is not completely united. There are some European countries that are leaning towards Russia, others leaning towards Ukraine. Europe seems to be governed by demographic fear of migration, and it's migration which will continue, which is fueling the continuation of populist right-wing either governments or political movements that might soon be governments in that sense. And I think it's because Europe is changing. It's moving from right-wing populism, and then once these populists gain power, they move into a kind of center-right Gaullist kind of position, and the European center, which used to take strong positions in international affairs, is somewhat out of gas.
This, of course, is a massive test for any administration. There's so many moving parts and so many hot zones, so many dangerous areas where things could really spin out of control. It requires a great deal of competence. And one thing we could say that the United States is suffering domestically is what we could call a crisis of competence, which is also expressed, I think, in a crisis of confidence of people not entirely trusting or feeling confident in institutions, whether it's to manage political change or to respond quickly in terms of foreign affairs. There is, as they call it, the Acela corridor, the pipeline or series of revolving doors connecting academia, Wall Street, and Washington. The big story over the holiday and into the new year was really the crisis of competence and confidence in higher education. In that American universities not
Yeah.
so long ago, certainly the time I came here and attended one, were regarded as being the world leaders. And what has played out instead has been a kind of public disintegration. How does this domestic drama affect how the US is seen and how it acts on the wider stage?
Well, it affects it because there's a less and less confidence in elites, whether it's elites in high positions in the governmental bureaucracy or it's elites at university, because the universities supply the high officials for government, at least until now, both Democratic and Republican administrations. And those upper and middle level bureaucrats have tended to come from the fine private colleges, which are now under who are now under reputational stress themselves. This is a bit ironic because President Joe Biden's foreign policy team has been actually the smoothest running in a generation. There have been virtually no resignations, no firings. It's the same team that took over when Biden became president in January 2021. They were all highly competent, though we can debate about how effective their policy has been. And there certainly doesn't seem to be much brilliance at all there, as opposed to previous administrations with George Shultz, James Baker, Henry Kissinger. Probably the only Biden official who reaches that level is the CIA director, William Burns. But remember, the CIA director is not a policy-making position. So he sits at the end of the table when the president convenes his National Security Council meetings. So there's a crisis of confidence, even though this team, the Biden's foreign policy team, has performed rather well, or at least competently, not brilliantly, maybe not correctly, but competently. But yes, there is this crisis of elites that, we can go into, we see around us.
It's interesting when we talk about the smooth functioning of a bureaucracy, we're talking about technocracy. And
Yes.
technocracy, like elites, is now a dirty word. Though we should note, of course, that the leader of the anti-elite party in the United States is himself a graduate of the Wharton School at UPenn. There is a difficulty here, which I think is as much to do with democracy as in general, rather than the specifics of the case in the United States, which is that the historical examples all suggest that foreign policy in particular, or any very complicated policy management over a long period of time, requires what the Chinese and latterly the Europeans would have called a mandarinate,
Yes.
a class of highly trained, often self-perpetuating experts. And of course, the methods for preventing it becoming merely a kind of aristocratic and rather self-interested and therefore less competent group have usually been competitive examinations. That was the Confucian system, and that was the
And that
system
used
which
to
of
be
the
our
Indian
system.
civil service, and it was,
Yeah.
of course, the American system until very
Yeah.
recently.
I mean, you couldn't get into the top schools without high test scores. And
Yeah.
those are being gradually eliminated now.
And
And
that's closer to a sort of aristocratic society in which having the right, literally the right manners or the right appearance, in this case in particularly, counts for more than ability or a demonstration that you might actually know something or even be too highly motivated. Nevertheless, there seems to be, as you're saying, a functioning technocracy, but people don't like technocracy, even though the benefits may be obvious.
yeah,
And
they don't
oh, sorry.
like it now, Dom, but I think you
They
know,
regret it. They'll miss it.
they'll regret it when it's no longer there. Because at
Yeah.
least, you may not be 100% happy with Biden's policy towards Israel and the Houthis and all of this. And you may think that he didn't give enough weapons to Ukraine when he should have, when it could have made a big difference. But just wait to see if there's ever a really incompetent, government in power.
Mm,
And, when you talk about the leading Republican candidate at the moment, Donald Trump, the very elite Mandarinate people he put into place in the Defense Department, in the National Security Advisor and Russian Affairs, I can name names, won't be there the second time around for Trump. Because the first time around, the elite wasn't sure about him and they were ambitious, so they took jobs in his administration because they thought he would be reformable. Once achieving the Oval
mm.
Office, that he would normalize in a way. And that didn't happen. So there's no confidence in the elite that he will normalize this time around, if in fact he is elected to a second non-consecutive term. So then you'll get even less competent government because it's not enough to believe the right things. America is an imperial bureaucratic system, and you have to have bureaucratic skills. You have to have all kind of management skills just to get the
Mhm.
policy implemented. It's not enough that Trump may want to make a deal with China. Even if he does want to make a deal with China, if he doesn't have the competent bureaucratic people below him, there will be no deal.
So in the long haul, because obviously bureaucracies work in the long haul, even though elected politicians don't. And from what you're saying, I think is right that a second Trump presidency would see increased privatization of this stuff in the way that say, for instance, the Abraham Accords was largely managed by a family member rather than the professionals.
Right. Yeah. And
Producing,
you can
sorry, go on.
say that worked, but it doesn't work across the board and it doesn't generally work, that kind of
Right.
system.
How can the universities be fixed, if they can be fixed, so that they manage to produce large numbers of the candidates that would be needed for the mandarinate who would run the imperial bureaucracy? Because that's not really taking place at the lower levels at the moment. I mean, as you're saying, the machinery has won, the policy has been pursued in a kind of steady manner, but there's been lots of walkouts and protests and performative, disgust and even resignations by people in the lower orders of the State departments in particular, who are themselves, of course, the graduates of America's finest colleges. How to fix this?
First of all, let me say that it's all of these problems are tough enough when the United States was on top of the world, when it dominated the world economy, when it was the only part of the industrial world not to suffer material infrastructure damage during World War II. In other words, I'm talking about the Cold War and the immediate post-Cold War. But nowadays, everything has been more equalized. Everyone has missiles now, so to speak. You have a group of tribesmen in Yemen, a country that's not even a country, able to wield missiles that can tie the US and British navies in knots. Essentially, we're seeing a great equalization take place where the United States, even when it has the Mandarinate ability to project power, finds it much harder than during the Cold War. I think with the universities, once you start choosing people not based on test scores, but on subjective factors or other objective factors, you're liable to end up not with incompetence, but with mediocrity. You know, test scores may have had a lot of things wrong with them. And there was this whole field of people writing about and judging the SAT
Mm.
test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, and IQ test, intelligence coefficient tests, all of that. But they were an objective measurement, essentially, in terms of having good predictive value of how a student would perform in college. Nowadays, that still holds in the science, engineering, math, and technology fields. It doesn't hold in the liberal arts as much, but it's from the liberal arts essentially that you get most of this foreign policy Mandarin aid, though that may shift. That may shift
Yeah,
in the
perhaps that would be the quickest, fastest answer would be not to
yeah.
recruit English
Remember,
lit
George
graduates.
Shultz was an economist. He wasn't a liberal arts major, so to speak. And former defense secretary, late defense secretary Ashton Carter was from the science and technology field rather than from the
Mm.
liberal arts, if I'm not mistaken, or was a hybrid of both. So that you could get a shift in that direction where you could get people more from the technology field suddenly filling these foreign policy positions over time.
I think this would be a particularly advantageous development because the nature of warfare is shifting very quickly due to technology, digitization in
Yeah, yeah.
particular. We've been talking about the strategic level and about institutional cultures, but as you mentioned, also we have this spectacle, which is almost a 19th century spectacle of massive blue water navies steaming into the Red Sea to deal with, as you're saying, recalcitrant tribesmen working with very low technology who are nevertheless able to put their thumb on a crucial artery of the global system. From a diplomatic point of view, the coalition that the US has pulled together, it's a great success, isn't it? There's no
Yes, it
doubt
is.
about that.
Another thing about what's going on between the Houthi tribesmen, who are mainly in northern Yemen, and the United States, British, and other navies is this also shows the primacy of geography because the Strait of Tears, the Strait of Bab el Mandeb is so narrow that ships have to be bunched together, and it's
Hmm.
easier to hit them. It becomes less of a challenge to actually aim a missile and hit a ship. So it's a question of geography, of the equalization on some levels of technology between tribesmen in Yemen and the most sophisticated people in the West. And you put the two together and you find a situation, and then you have the United States being and this coalition being self-limiting. And it's self-limiting because the real enemy in all of this Middle East instability and war is Iran. Iran is real, whether it's Houthis, whether it's Gaza, whether it's attacks in Syria or Iraq, we're essentially in a de facto war with Iran. And Israel is in less of a de facto, but more and more of a real war with Iran. And Iran is a very highly technical state. It can build its own drones that Russia needs in Ukraine. It can target ships. It has intelligence gathering. It is a nuclear program. With all the talk about Iran's nuclear program, it's sometimes lost that just to have such a program shows the high level of education and technology achieved by Iranians that would exist even in a different Iranian government.
And this, I think, is inarguable. Day by day, the headlines suggest an accelerating multi-front confrontation in which the United States, like it or not, is involved to varying degrees. It seems to me that the imbalance between the simple expense of maintaining and using ships and navy, a whole navy, basically being oriented towards the Mediterranean and the Middle East, versus cheap technology such as drones and rockets, which are plentiful. And we, even after the 100-day mark of the Israel-Hamas war, Hamas is still able to fire rockets, despite the vast majority of the territory now being in Israeli hands. We also saw in recent weeks the Ukrainians shot down a Russian A-50 surveillance platform aircraft, which is priced at around a third of $1 billion. And it's not clear with what kind of missile it was shot down with, but you can guarantee that it was much, much cheaper. In the long haul, do you think all of these coalition partners committed, given the economic straits that the European powers find themselves in, if one of their ships gets dinged, are they likely to stay the course, do you think?
That's a very good question. But here again, from what you just said, we're seeing the equalization of war, where a
Mhm.
relatively cheap homemade missile can strike a $300 million air platform. And we saw this during the Iraq War when we were using F-16s, and the other side, the West, the United States was using F-16s, and the insurgents were using roadside bombs,
Mhm.
essentially to drive us out, to drive the United States out of Iraq. This has been a trend in warfare for a long time, a kind of equalization. Everyone writes about AI and everything, but meanwhile, if you look at the greater Middle East, if you look what's going on in Gaza, if you look what's going on in the southern Red Sea, if you look what's going on in Iraq and Syria, what you see is fairly low-tech warfare combined with high-tech targeting. It's a blend. It's a real blend.
One thing which is not equal between the parties here is time, because the United States, and this is the year of elections, apparently more people are going to vote in 2024, many of them in elections of dubious probity, but nevertheless, they're at least going to go through it than ever before. And this is likely not to, on current form, it's quite possible to produce a drastic change of government in the US, and probably around the same time, in fact, in the UK, as there'll be elections there almost certainly by the end of the year too.
Yeah.
And it's expected, on the current polling, to be a disaster for the Conservative government. And the Labour government that will come in was probably not going to be as receptive to joining United States in its foreign entanglements. It seems to me that the Biden administration is going to have a very hard job of containing hostilities with Iran And that is the policy, which is being performed very, very smoothly, and a certain amount of looking the other way has taken place as well, I think, in order to hold it in place. It seems to me that's going to be very difficult to stick to, simply because the Iranians will keep pushing it if there's not a serious reaction at some point.
Yes. See, democracy has a lot of benefits, but one of its drawbacks is short-term thinking and the lack of military planning. This was pointed out in the 19th century by a great American naval strategist, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who said, free societies are not good at military preparedness, especially in the middle and long term. And, elected governments, run by cycles. They have elected visions, which last only 2 or 4 years or something. Whereas the Iranian regime, that's there until the regime doesn't exist anymore. And at some point, that will be true, but it's certainly not on the immediate horizon now. So the Iranian problem will almost certainly outlast the 2024 elections in both the United States and Great Britain. That, automatically hands the advantage to the other side in a way. Also, keep in mind the Biden administration has had a legacy problem. It's had people in high positions who were party to the 2015 nuclear accords with Iran and have been struggling mightily to try to resurrect them. Now that attempt, that exercise is run out now. They're not doing that anymore. But for a number of years, of the Biden administration, they were very much averse to taking a hard line to Iran because they really thought they can get it back on track with a deal. Now that that's impossible, they've lost a lot of time and a lot of leverage.
And one thing that often does happen in the more responsive of democratic systems is that when something has failed and there's a crisis, you very often get a new generation or a new group of people moving into these positions, in that there is a
Yeah.
pragmatic aspect. So we may well see some kind of turnover or a
Yeah.
shift anyway in the diplomatic worldview to
And,
accompany this.
and we're going to see it in Israel too.
I was going
Remember,
to add, yeah, an election
yeah,
there seems highly
uh,
likely.
the disaster of the 1973 war ultimately led to the end of labor dominance, decades-old labor dominance in Israel, and the rise of the right wing in Israel, which has essentially been in power more or less since then. It takes time because Israel is a democratic process, but I think the disaster of October 7th will lead to major electoral and maybe even institutional change in Israel, given a year or two or
I mean,
three.
the a lot of the predictions for 2024 in the early part of this year were all doom and gloom. So I would like to end with some suggestions for some small positive things that might yet transpire. Perhaps there is a possibility of further warming of relations between the US and China, or at least they're not deteriorating further. There seems to be an effort
Well,
on both sides there.
that's fair enough. I think the election of Lai Ching-te, William Lai, in Taiwan was something the Chinese expected. The media is making a very big fuss about it, but I think the Chinese had factored that in already. They knew he was going to win. And I think the Chinese and the Americans both want to avoid any accidental military engagement in the Western Pacific because that would be a disaster for
Mm.
financial markets upon which both governments depend, essentially, and a disaster for supply chains, again, upon which both governments depend. So I think there's commonality that we're not going to be friends, but we can manage this relationship so that there's no disaster.
And another possibility of a more optimistic end to 24 than it began with, I would cautiously suggest, would be on the Israeli-Palestinian front, in fact. As one thing
Yes.
the United States badly wants, certainly the administration before the November 24 elections, is to have some kind of re-engagement and peace processing and reconstruction and so on. And all of that, the administration has been working very hard on, while simultaneously trying to manage the war. The prospects for some kind of re-engagement afterwards, as you mentioned, the Saudis publicly saying that they're still committed afterwards. These actually are quite heartening and suggest that the old paradigm actually has broken and there is a possibility for some kind of progress.
Yes.
Or at least
Remember,
improvement.
after the debacle of the 73 war, Israel ended up having two disengagement accords with Egypt, one disengagement accord with Syria, all of which lasted for decades and led eventually to an Israel-Egypt peace treaty 6 years after the 73 war. So it is possible that this debacle in Gaza could shake things up in a way, whereas the Saudis and the Egyptians are able to nudge Israel to some sort of acceptance of a Palestinian state in some form. That's perfectly reasonable.
So it's not all doom and gloom for the year. I'm glad to hear
No.
that. Well, you've been listening to me, Dominic Green, with Robert Kaplan on The First Draft, a podcast from the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. Be sure to subscribe to The First Draft on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified about new episodes. To explore more podcasts and upcoming events, please visit us on www.fpri.org.